Okay, so we're going to pick up right where we left off last week, and that is chapter 19, verse 15, and that's on page, 1915, page 1100, a nice round number. Again, chapter 19, verse 15. And we've been dealing with sort of judicial things, various institutions in ancient Israel. We looked at prophets, we've looked at kings, we've looked at judges, and now we get some specific legal legislation. Again, beginning with verse 15, chapter 19. A single witness may not validate against a person any guilt or blame for any offense that may be committed. That is to say, you can't have the testimony of only one witness to validate a claim, one person versus another, or to find someone guilty of an offense. It can be only valid on the testimony of two witnesses, or actually the literal text is Shnei edim o al pi shlosha edim, two or three. But most scholars, ancient and modern, assume that two or three means at least two, not that it's limited to three. Presumably, if you have five witnesses to something, that doesn't invalidate it. But if we said two witnesses, you might come to the conclusion that there have to be two and no more, that the court could only hear the testimony of two. And this we've seen before, right? But what's new now is what follows, beginning with verse 16. If a man appears against another to testify maliciously and gives false testimony against him, the two parties to the dispute will appear before the Lord, before the magistrates, priests, the authority at the time, and the magistrates will make a thorough investigation. So now we have a case that we have what are called edim zomimim, lying witnesses, right? Someone who comes forth and says, yeah, I was there and I saw this, and they didn't see it. Maybe they got paid not to say that they saw it, or for whatever reason, they come forth, and now we need a thorough investigation. What does that mean? It means we now need witnesses against the witness, because that's what an investigation is. It's the calling of witnesses. And the Talmud actually goes into this question of, well, what if we are concerned that one of the witnesses who's called to testify that someone was a lying witness was himself lying? And do we need then more witnesses? And, you know, as they say in Hebrew, ein ledavar sof, there's no end to the matter, ad infinitum, but presumably one doesn't have to go that far. They're going to investigate, and presumably the witness has said, I was in such and such a place at such and such a time, and I saw this. Perhaps they say, I saw that witness who claimed to be in Jersey City. I was in Montclair, and I saw him there at the time that the murder was committed. So he couldn't possibly have seen it. It's something like that. And so now there's a question raised against the witness. The witnesses come, they make an investigation, the magistrates, and if the man is a false witness who has testified falsely, you will do to him what he schemed to do to the other. So the punishment here needs to exactly fit the crime. This person says that something didn't happen. Let's say someone took money from someone else. He has to pay that money. exactly what the consequences were you should do to him, and therefore you should sweep the evil away from your midst. Others will hear and be afraid, and such things will not be done in your midst. Right? So the idea is, he testified falsely. People will learn that false testimony is punished. And I want to go a step further. Even though there were no consequences, right? In other words, there's a trial. This false witness comes forward. The false witness's testimony is disproved. And so they, in a sense, right, they haven't done any harm. They intended to do harm, but in the end, they got caught. So no harm has been done. Nonetheless, the court imposes this penalty because the harm, though it hasn't been done to, let's say it's litigation, to the two litigants, it's been done to the judicial system. We can't have people testifying falsely. And that seems to be, if you go back and remember, that's also a violation of the Ten Commandments, right? This, false testimony. So it's a serious matter, not just in its circumstance, but in general. And now we get this statement, which is very familiar. So it said, nor should you show pity, right? Because you could say, well, no, nothing bad actually happened. And now there are going to be terrible consequences for this lying witness. Don't show any pity. Life for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot. Right? So whatever he was going to cause, that is done to him. And this is, of course, very, very difficult to modern sensibilities. Right? You were going to have somebody's hand cut off, you'll get your hand cut off, and someone was going to lose an eye, so you'll lose an eye, and so on. I think even in its biblical context, the meaning of this is that just as in the case of the lying witness, the punishment has to fit the crime. And this is true for everyone. There, in certain ancient societies, for example, following the Code of Hammurabi, it depended what your social status was, what kind of a punishment you would receive, right? Someone of high status would not be punished in the way that someone of low status would be punished. Here, no such distinctions are made. And what this seems to be indicating is this and no more, right? If someone stole from someone, right, then you can take money away from them, but you can't execute them for theft. Nonetheless, the rabbis are deeply troubled by this. And so they say, other than in a capital case, this is always about financial compensation. That if you have injured someone and they have, they've lost their hand or the use of their hand, you have to compensate them for that loss, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible to execute justice fairly. And they give, for example, the idea of a one-eyed man who has injured a two-eyed person. So he put out that two-eyed person's eye, therefore rendering him a one-eyed man like himself. But if we were to follow this strictly, we would have to take out his other eye, right? Therefore making him blind, which is not actually a punishment which is commensurate with the damage that he did. And the rabbis give a variety of other examples also. And so they emphatically deny that this has anything to do with knocking out someone's tooth because, because he knocked out someone's tooth and so on. And they limit it strictly to monetary compensation, and that the monetary compensation has to reflect, in some sense, what they have caused. It can't be greater. Now, you might think about the fact that this actually then opens up the possibility that there will be, in some ways, different outcomes for different people. If, for example, you render a skilled workman unable to work because of what you've done, and let's say you broke the hands of a pianist, right? So you could say, concert pianist, right? And you could say, well, you broke his hands, your hands have to be broken. But in fact, that doesn't really compensate for the damage you've done to his livelihood, right? And so again, the idea here is financial compensation commensurate with the damage, not literally an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a foot for a foot, and so on. Bible scholars think, maybe, maybe not. Maybe, and this is based on other ancient peoples who seem to have done this kind of thing. At any rate, Jewish law takes this simply as meaning equal compensation, and they place it here, and it's elsewhere also, but they place it here in the context of doing to someone what they intended to do to a third party. And okay, so I'm going to leave it there, and we're going to move on to the law. Yes, go ahead, Barry.
I have a few things to say about this passage. Sure. So for one thing, it starts with the concept of a malicious witness. We also require at least two witnesses. So that there raises the question of, do you have one malicious witness and then one other? Well, you need two.
Yes, you need two. So what I think you're asking is this, right? So if there are three witnesses, right? Let's say there are three witnesses, right? So one of them gets disqualified and is going to be punished, but I still have two, right? So I can continue with the case because I still have two. I don't know if that's what you meant.
Yeah, I'm just considering that if there are two, you could have.
Yes.
One. Well, you would have one witness. Presumably there are two. You have two, at least two, who bear this false witness.
Yeah. Now, and you could have two false witnesses too, right? They could be colluding. I think of these cases, where these mafia cases where they've gotten to people. At least you see this on TV, right? They've gotten to people, and all of a sudden the witnesses dry up. Right? And there are no now witnesses. People who used to claim to see something now claim that they didn't see it, and so on, right? So yeah, I mean, you could have more than one false witness. It could be you could have three witnesses and two of them are false, and that's the end of the case. Yeah, you said you had a couple of comments.
That's just another observation. It seems as if this famous, well-known statement, "Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth," refers not to the person who originally committed the crime, but it's related to the malicious witness.
I'm not sorry I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, usually we think of this statement of applying to if a person does wrong, then there's the justice is meted out to that person with this, equity.
Yeah.
But here in this paragraph, the subject of this paragraph is really the malicious witness.
Right. The assumption is, right, the assumption is all of the regular laws apply. And now what do we do with a false witness? Right? So this is not meant to this is to supplement, not to replace anything else. And what is, all they've done is speak or fail to speak, right? So, and maybe they didn't influence the outcome of the case at all. So you could understand someone saying, well, okay, didn't hurt anything. They're just talking, right? But no, because it could have hurt something, and it undermines the whole judicial process. And so the Torah here wants to deal with that specific subject.
But I'm not getting my point across. So you have the defendant.
Yes.
You have the witness. So this passage seems to address what happens to a false witness.
Yes.
But there's also we usually interpret this last statement for an eye tooth for tooth applying to the guilty defendant.
Yes, and it's really extending that idea to, and it's really using it in a different way, right? And I think that is further indication for the rabbis that what's being implied here is only fair compensation.
Okay,
Because,
so I have two more points to make. And then
sure.
If you cut off someone's foot with the medical state of medical attention back then, I would imagine that could lead to death from bleeding.
Yes, I mean, presumably they cauterized the foot, but yeah.
And the last thing I want to say about this is that there is a code of justice where if you steal, your hand gets cut off.
Yes, right, and that certainly is not
As an example.
Even in biblical law, that's exact that this law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, meaning compensation or punishment that fits the crime, would not allow that kind of a punishment, right? Because theft and maiming someone are two very different things. So the only possible compensation in a case where someone steals something is actually financial compensation. There's nothing else they can. I mean, today we might imprison them or something, but here the Torah doesn't envision a world of prisons. Really doesn't.
There was one more thing I wanted to say. We consider ourselves enlightened. However, we incarcerate people for drug use, which would almost seem to be a victimless. In many cases, victimless.
We seem to feel like we've made enormous progress, and not so much. Maybe it's been a step backward in some areas. I know there were several hands. I see a lot of hands. Saul.
I just want to say very briefly, I came in late, but why does it say al pnei shnei edim or al pnei shlosha edim? Why do they have to say three?
Okay, so the idea is three or more. In other words, it's not simply two. And the third is really there to stand for more. You can have as many witnesses. And if you think about it, in this case of edim zomimim, where you have lying witnesses, you really need more than two, right? So somebody is going to be disqualified, or a witness themselves has come forward and their testimony is just not accepted. So this is a minimum. But it's another way of saying, on the basis of one witness alone, no one can be convicted. I saw a bunch of other hands, Sandy, and then Myra, and Anna. Go ahead, Sandy.
So, Rabbi, this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, does that also apply to masters and their slaves? And did slaves get money? Just in
That's
general,
a
did they get
that
money?
is a really good question. And the answer, I don't know. And I would suspect maybe not. But I don't know. Because the status of a slave as an independent person who's entitled to property of any kind doesn't seem to be the case. But I really can't say because I don't know.
Did they get money? Did they get?
I don't know.
Okay, okay. I mean, just in general, not for being hurt or anything, but did slaves, they just got like room and board, but they also
they are paying off a debt.
Oh.
But that's the assumption about slaves. So they're not earning income because the income they would have earned is going to the slaveholder to pay off their debt. But as we mentioned before, when they are released from slavery, they have to be given the wherewithal to be independent. So in a sense, they're getting back pay. you could see it that way. Myra.
Yeah, although it doesn't mention it here, is it just men who are the witnesses or in the Bible, or would it be?
Yes,
Yes.
Okay, so yes, the assumption here is that men are witnesses, and that assumption carries through rabbinic law as well. There are a variety of qualifications for a person to be a witness. And one of them, classically speaking, is that they be male. There are different explanations for it. A woman is not an independent actor. Her husband could compel her to do X or Y, so we don't know how impartial she is. Worse than that, we have a statement somewhere in the Talmud, Nashim da'atan kalot, which means women are not. They don't understand things. They're lightheaded. They don't understand weighty matters. Although there are exceptions where if it's in the world of women, then they get to testify. But in general, they don't. And this disqualification actually within the conservative movement became one of the reasons why the question of women becoming rabbis was a real question. Because one of the things that rabbis often have to do is serve as witnesses. And by the way, if you can't be a witness, you can't be a judge. It's the same thing. So a rabbi often serves on a beit din, right? Your rabbinic court. Somebody's converted, there's a divorce, whatever it is, this would disqualify. Now, the argument on the other side is, well, there are rabbis who can't go to the cemetery because they're Kohanim. And so women could be rabbis, they just wouldn't do these things. Ultimately, the conservative movement took a much more radical and in my mind, appropriate stand to say that was then, this is now. We accept women just as we count them in the minyan and call them to the Torah. We will accept them as witnesses. Having said all that, I will tell you that when I have done weddings and people have said to me, I want this person and that person to sign the ketubah, I've reminded them that if there are, a woman or two women as the signatories, there are some people who would question the validity of the ketubah. I'm fine with it. I'm happy to have women sign the ketubah, but, full disclosure, you should understand that if this is what you're going to do, you do open yourself up to that possibility. Now, is that possibility meaningful? Not particularly as far as I'm concerned, but, One could, I suppose, foresee a circumstance. I would also mention the fact that a ketubah itself is not enough to a bad ketubah is not enough to necessarily disqualify a wedding. So much on male and female
you.
witnesses. Hannah, go ahead.
Yeah, I believe even today there are Arab countries that will cut off the hands of thieves.
Yeah, Saudi
You know which
Arabia.
countries do that?
So, I'm sorry, there are countries that do it. Yeah.
Do you know what countries do that?
I don't know. I have a feeling that Saudi Arabia is one of them, but I'm not at all sure. I'm always amused, you look at things like that and then you see, but the world is up in arms about Israel because they built a wall to protect themselves. And the double standards that are applied are staggering, just staggering. But that, of course, has nothing to do with this. Any other questions before we go ahead, Saul?
I looked in Mishpatim, and in Mishpatim it says if you injure your slave, they go free.
Yeah, so there's compensation. The question is if the slave is owed something. I don't think that was quite Sandy's question. Sandy's question was what could be. Well, yeah, in a way it is. Okay, thank you. Yes. On the other hand, all you have to do is free them. You don't have to have, what's their freedom worth? And that becomes the question. If it's going to be equal compensation, on what level? How long did they have left to pay off their debt? If it takes 6 years and they've been working for 5.5, yes, now they go free, but it's very different if they've served 1 year and they're paying off a 6-year debt. And if we want it to be commensurate in some sense, it becomes more complicated. But yes, thank you for that. Okay, we're going to go on, and we're moving on to laws of warfare. And some of them are quite, I think, some of them are quite surprising. So we're in chapter 20 now. When you take the field against your enemies, and the assumption is that this will involve the conquest of the land, but it's not limited to that. It's when the Israelites go to war and you see horses and chariots, forces larger than yours, have no fear. So horses and chariots are the big technology in the ancient world. The Philistines and Pharaoh had them. The Philistines have them and the Philistines are going to become the enemies of Israel after the period that they enter the land. The ancient Hebrews do not have horses and chariots, right? So you don't have the right weapons. They have a big army. You'd have reason to be afraid. Have no fear, for the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, is with you. And I think it goes on, right? What does it say that he is with you? He is in the midst of you. That not just God is, kind of rooting for you or on your side, but God is fighting alongside of you. I'm reminded of the phrase from the Song at the Sea, Adonai ish melchama. God is a man of war. Not a horse, by the way. God is a man of war. And therefore, you have nothing to be afraid of. God is there fighting with you and for you. And now we have a procedure. If you're going to go to war, the following things are going to happen in preparation for going to war. And the assumption here is not a standing army, right? That in the case of a war, troops are mustered, Before they go into battle, the priests come forward and address the troops. And he's going to say, "Hear, O Israel," right? "You are about to join battle with your enemy. Let not your courage falter. Do not be in fear or in panic or in dread of them. For it is the Lord your God who marches with you to do battle for you against your enemy to bring you victory." Okay? God's going to be with you. Don't worry. And then we get the following fascinating passage. Then the officials address the troops as follows. "Is there anyone who has built a new house but has not dedicated it? Let him go back to his home, lest he die in battle and another dedicate it." Right? So you just built a house. Not clear what dedication means. Maybe it just means lived in it. Right? You haven't had the chance to enjoy this very expensive or backbreaking undertaking, right? Go home. This is, by the way, not an exemption like you can go home. Let him go home, lest he die in battle, and someone else will take it. "Is there anyone who has planted a vineyard and has not harvested it? Let him go home, lest he die in battle and another harvest it. Is there anyone who has paid the bride price for a wife, but has not yet married her? Let him go back to his home, lest he die in battle and another marry her." So the bride price, there are two stages in ancient Israelite marriage. The first is the payment of the mohar, which is a sum that is paid to the father of the potential bride. Not clear why he would do this or why the father needs this, but it seems to be an established practice. And once that has been paid, this is the equivalent of giving someone an engagement ring. Right? You pay the bride price. Now you're engaged, and therefore you are as close to being married as you can without cohabitating. And now you're going to go into war, and you're not going to actually have an opportunity to go through on the engagement, and therefore what? Let him go home, lest he die in battle and another one marry her. And then finally, we get this. The official shall go on addressing the troops and say, "Is there anyone afraid or disheartened? Let him go home, lest the courage of his comrades flag like his." And when the officials have finished addressing the troops, army commanders assume control. Right? It's stunning in some ways. Right? Can you imagine if such exemptions were given out today? So how do we even account for it? Well, I want to say two things about it. The first is, since God is fighting with you, you don't have to worry. You're gonna win, right? You're gonna have to fight. It's not that God is fighting the battle and you get to stand back, and people are gonna die, but victory is assured. And because victory is assured, we can allow these deferments. In fact, we can insist on them. But underlying this is also a view of life. And that is that people are entitled to live and to enjoy their lives. And failure to be able to enjoy the house you built or the vineyard you planted or the woman that you have become engaged to, unacceptable. Unacceptable. Better you should go home. And now, if you're afraid, that's not quite the same thing. There, it's instrumental. Our concern is that you are going to, your fear, your cowardice is going to be contagious in a certain way. People will lose heart, and they won't go ahead and do what they need to do. So here we know what's going to happen before the war starts. And now we're getting closer to the war. When you approach a town to attack it, you should offer terms of peace. If it responds peacefully and lets you in, the people there will serve you at forced labor. So it's not just that they say welcome and now you're in charge, but they are going to become your servants. If he does not surrender, if it doesn't surrender, join battle, you shall lay siege to it. And when the Lord your God delivers it into your hands, you'll put its males to the sword, but you can take his booty, the women, the children, the livestock, everything that is in the town, all of its spoil, and enjoy the use of the spoil of your enemy, right? And this was pretty standard in antiquity. This is what would happen in a war. The idea here, the important idea is they get an out. You can't just attack them. And that is unusual in ancient times. And, wars were fought for territory all the time. In some ways, what the Russians are doing in Ukraine right now, except by the standards of our day, that, has become anomalous, thank God. But in antiquity, it was done regularly. People would go in, they would give the town they're about to offer an opportunity to accept them. If not, these are the consequences. And now we get to something else, which is very striking. So you deal with this, thus you shall deal with the towns that lay far from you, towns that do not belong to the nations hereabout. In the towns of the latter people, however, which the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage, you shall not let a soul remain alive. You must prescribe them, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The Lord your God has commanded you, lest they lead you into doing all the abhorrent things that they have done to their gods, and you stand guilty before them. So what we seem to be commanded here to do is genocide. Wipe them out completely because of their practices, which will be a lure to you. Question is, did they do it? And most scholars who've studied this think they didn't. And there are a variety of reasons for that. One is that there is archaeological evidence which supports the idea that the Israelites came and conquered the land. There is virtually no archaeological evidence of cities being wiped out. It's known that they did it. There's proof that they did it. But this idea of wiping out the entire population didn't happen. More than that, you don't have to take archaeologists' word for it. The Bible itself seems to attest that it didn't happen. We see in the book of Joshua and in the book of Judges that Canaanites and Hivites and Jebusites continued to live in the land. In fact, when David goes to conquer Jerusalem and make it his capital, he has to fight the Jebusites. Right? They're not exterminated. And one Bible scholar that I read said this was actually, this whole idea that there was some kind of mass genocide was, the book of Deuteronomy was written, of course, much later. During that period, there were no Canaanites around. And the author of Deuteronomy simply assumed, well, what must have happened to them? They must have been wiped out. I don't know how credible that is. I would also note that later Jewish sources seem to be unanimous in the sense that this was not to be done. All the people had to do was to attest to the fact that they'll give up these abhorrent practices, and they have to follow what are called the 7 Noahide laws, basic laws of humanity, decency, and so on. And they're not going to be executed. Maimonides, in his code, says no one should ever be executed for this. And Moshe Greenberg, who was one of the great classical scholars of the Hebrew Bible, taught at University of Pennsylvania for many years and then went off to Hebrew University, said something which I think is true about a lot of these circumstances. And what he says essentially is it's inconsistent with the ethics of the rest of the Torah. That this is such an outlier that we can't, it's not credible that the same document, which commands in so many places a certain compassionate orientation to the world, would at the same time command this kind of execution. So I've got one more thing that I want to look at, and so let's move right on to it, and then we'll take questions. When you war against a city that you have besieged for a long time in order to capture it, you must not destroy its trees. And this is the fruit trees. Wielding the axe against them, you may eat from them, but you must not cut them down. Then we have this very enigmatic statement: are trees of the field like human beings to withdraw before you into the besieged city, right? Can they run away? Only trees that you know do not yield food may be destroyed. You can cut them down for constructing siege works against the city that is waging war on you until it has been reduced, right? The idea is it's a long siege. If it's a short siege, presumably you wouldn't even try because you'll want that fruit for yourself, but things are getting desperate now. Long periods of time, and you've got to do something. And so you cut down the fruit trees, and the answer is no. You're not allowed to do that. Not all is fair in love and war. Certain things are beyond the pale. And I want to, if you have Eitz Chaim, I want to draw your attention to the note 19 at the bottom. You must not destroy its trees. We are not to be so carried away in time of war that we forget that the war will be over one day and people will have to live and feed their families in the place where the battles are now raging. Beyond that, Maimonides writes, no one who cuts down a fruit tree, not only one who cuts down a fruit tree, but anyone who destroys household goods, tears clothing, demolishes a building, stops up a spring, or ruins food deliberately, violates the prohibition of Bal Tashchit, you must destroy. Many legal systems, including laws in the United States, permit people to destroy their own property. Jewish law teaches that we are only the custodians, not the true owners of our property. This law of Bal Tashchit becomes the fundamental text behind Jewish environmentalism. This idea that we have that we're required to preserve the environment and that we can't destroy things unnecessarily is sort of fundamental, and it can be joined with one other text, perhaps more, but one that's well known. And I'm going back now to the very beginning of Genesis. The Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden, and then these words, la'avda u'l'shamra, to till it, to work it, and to protect it. And what we have here is the idea that we are entitled to use the resources of the world. That's one of the reasons that they're there. They're there for us, but we also have to preserve them and protect them. And that balance has to be struck. And when you destroy things so they won't be usable in the future, you have violated that balance. And so this text, and I think this is typical of rabbinic thinking in general, this text, which seems to apply to a very particular circumstance. You're at war, you're sieging, we're talking about fruit trees. That's all we're talking about here. Gets expanded in classic Jewish sources to an environmental ethic. Okay, we're going to stop there. And oops, that's the wrong way to go. Hold on. I welcome your questions or comments. Hannah first.
Can you just repeat the Hebrew saying of that? I like that.
Bal tashchit.
Wasn't
which
there
is-
more to it?
Don't destroy.
But preserve, wasn't there more to it?
Oh, no. Well, here, when we're talking about trees, it's
Mhm.
don't destroy. When we look at the text, which refers to the Garden of Eden, it's lovda, to work the land, right? To derive things from it. Ula shomra, from shomer, to protect it. Okay?
Thank you.
But in general, when one talks about environmental law, it's bal tashchit, the prohibition against destruction. Other questions, comments, anything at all before we wrap it up for this year? Saul.
It's interesting that in the Hertz that I have, he quotes Evan Ezra. The trees of the besieged city must not be cut down because they are vital to man. And then he talks about Bal Tashchit. So we're talking about hundreds of years ago, the same argument.
Yeah, I think that argument is inherent in the Torah itself. The question is, how broadly do you take it? Is it limited simply to besieging a city? And I think you could also extrapolate something else from it, which isn't really environmental in the same way. But what happens when you plant landmines as part of your warfare? And now the war is going to end, and they're still there, right? So this idea that there need to be rules of war, and that they need to prohibit certain things, that it's not all fair in love and war. It's not anything you want. I don't know if you read today, it's horrible, but Russians have blown up now a dam and causing widespread flooding in Ukraine. I mean, and moving those floodwaters now moving towards a nuclear power plant. It's exactly this kind of thing that the Torah is really speaking against here. Even in the context of the idea that people have a right to go to war. There was another hand. Yeah, go ahead.
So there's rules of war. We don't want to do to the enemy what we don't. Well, the base of the golden rule. We don't want to do to the enemy what they might do to
Yes.
us.
Yeah, you could see, don't do to someone else what you wouldn't want them to do to you.
That's in this case, there seems to be self-interest. We don't destroy these fruit trees because after we win the war, we're going to want to use those fruit trees.
Yes, yeah. I think the broader
you don't have a rule here. Don't murder all the men, because if we lose, we wouldn't want them to murder all of our men.
Yes. No, you don't have that. I think the fear with murdering the men is simply that they will continue to be there and will, eventually fight against you.
As will the sons the children who you allow to live.
Yeah, I think your point though is well taken. On the there's a difference. I mean, I don't think this idea that you murder the men, it was the way of the world in antiquity. There's you're allowed to do it, everybody does. Here, Yeah, here we seem to have a much broader ethic.
And then I want to, as a separate point. So, so that the people's, the victims were not totally destroyed, as you know, as you say. But the reason for sort of completely destroying these enemies is that God didn't want them adopting the pagan
Yes.
ways.
Yeah,
But they weren't destroyed, and it turns out that there's a pattern where the Jewish people do adopt pagan ways, and the
yeah, I would,
prophets rail, and for that the Jewish people are punished.
yeah, I do think that it's particular pagan practices that are considered abhorrent. Remember, we looked at the idea of child sacrifice, for example. So, you know, pagan ways is, I think, perhaps too general here. And it's not that they're not allowed, pagans are not allowed to worship their gods, because they are, according to Deuteronomy. But they can't worship them in certain ways. And those ways now could, you know, could be appealing to Israelites and lead them astray. Okay.
My point is only is that we can take the approach of, you know, somewhat, you know, apologetic, that despite what it says here, that Jewish people did not completely destroy their enemies.
Jewish people did not what? I'm sorry.
Did not completely destroy their enemies in victory.
Yes, no, that's true.
So we're a good people because we didn't destroy our enemies. However, by not destroying our enemies, it did lead to the
yes, yeah.
I mean, punishment for not, well, for leaving that temptation and succumbing to the temptation.
Yeah, I think there's certainly something to be said for that. Anybody else? Not seeing anybody, I want to thank you again for studying with me this year. It's been a great pleasure and enlightening to me, and I hope to you. As I mentioned at the outset, we'll pick up in September. I'll send you an email over the summer letting you know exactly when and what we're going to be studying. I welcome your suggestions as to what you might be interested in studying once we complete Deuteronomy, which I suspect will take us about a month. So next year will be largely devoted to something else. And what that is, I'll let you know over the summer, but I welcome your suggestions. I had one suggestion that we should, rather than studying a continuous text, that we should look at the weekly Torah portion each week. Certainly a possibility. The downside to that is that there are Torah portions that, you know, you could spend the whole year almost looking at. And then there are others that are basically about skin disease. So, you know, most of the Torah you could do that with. Parts of the Torah, it would be a challenge to talk for an hour about Tazria. Not to say it can't be done. So, or some combination. Anyway, thanks again. I'll send out the.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank
Oh,
you.
Have a good summer.
It's been
Thank you.
such a
Thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you.
Look for the recording. And if there are classes that you miss, you know, the recordings are all up there. They'll be there forever. So feel free to look back. All right, thanks.
Are you having any new podcasts that we should know
Am I
about?
having so I just, since you mentioned it, I just recorded, which are coming out. We sat for an hour and a half and we talked about gender fluidity, which is this whole question about gender and different genders. And I think it's a fascinating subject. It's going to be the next 3 podcasts because we try to keep it down to 20, 25 minutes each. What we think about it, what the tradition thinks about it. I thought it was an extremely rich conversation, probably one of the best we've done. So I invite you to, and now, by the way, since you asked, we have a website which is up. It's another way to access things. It's still in progress, but you can get there. And the website is it's www.Common Grounds Podcast.
Can you send it?
Yeah, I'll send it out. Absolutely. Yeah, that would make it easier.
Yes.
So when I send out the recording, I'll send it out to you all. But it's Common Grounds Podcast.
.com
That-
or .net?
I don't remember, but if you
You'll let us know.
simply search Common Grounds Podcast as a single word,
No, it's over.
it should take you.
It's okay.
But I'm not quite sure if
It's supposed to be.
it's .what, but you shouldn't have any trouble, and I will send it
Oh,
out.
good.
All right.
Is this new
All right,
one up
everybody.
already?
Thank you.
Have
Thanks
a
very
great
much.
have a great week and a good summer. If I don't talk to you, and see you in the fall.
Good.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks again.